Good evening. I'm Lori Rabasha, the Executive Director of Grua Center. It's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's conversation. Grua Center's mission is to engage community via arts and culture, and we do so by presenting a variety of concerts, art exhibitions, and speakers on a wide range of topics. We are now presenting these events as best we can on digital platforms like Zoom. If you are new to us, welcome. We hope you'll find occasion to return. Again, in this virtual world, or hopefully in person one day soon. We start with a little housekeeping. I am coming to you from Grua Center's office in Stonington, and our program director, Kelly Rocherol, is behind the scenes from her home office. We welcome your questions and ask you to write them in the Q&A section on your screen, and we'll do our best to get to them after our guests have chatted. Tonight's discussion is scheduled to go about 90 minutes. Our discussion will be recorded and available on Grua Center's YouTube channel, hopefully by the middle of the month. This is also the time when I take a moment to thank the many people who donate to Grua Center's annual fund, and I know some of you are with us tonight. Those gifts are really a big part of making our year-round programming possible, and those annual fund dollars matter more than ever during this pandemic when many of our usual activities are curtailed and we can't gather together in person. But the next best thing is gathering together on Zoom. We are delighted to partner with the Jewish Federation of Eastern Connecticut and bringing their exhibition entitled Stories of Resilience, Encountering Racism to Grua Center. I had the pleasure of being in the audience for the exhibit back in February when it first opened at the Lyman Allen Art Museum. It's an exhibit about stories, and several subjects of that exhibit, Lonnie Braxton, Florence Clarke, and Danetta Hodge, told some of their personal stories about growing up in the Jim Crow era in our first panel discussion. That discussion is available for you to view on our YouTube channel, along with our second panel discussion last month, which was moderated by Gail McDonald and included younger generations of Black leaders in our community, Curtis Goodwin, Colton Harris, and Tamara Lanier, as well as a dose of 19th century history that was delivered by Tom Shook. We are also grateful to the Lyman Allen for their help in mounting our exhibit, and to the Dominion Energy Charitable Foundation for their financial support. We are even more grateful to Tammy Kay, the Jewish Federation's program manager, who we worked with so very closely to mount the exhibit in our space, and to Jerry Fisher, the recently retired and longtime executive director of the Jewish Federation, who was instrumental in making the exhibit happen, and he's gathered together all of our panelists. In tonight's panel, we hear from faith leaders in our region about how they are responding to the issue of racism. So tonight, we also send our deepest thanks to our panelists, Reverend Lloyd McKenzie Jr., Reverend Carolyn Patierno, and Rabbi Jeremy Schwartz, as well as our moderator, Lisa McGinley, for their willingness to share their stories. As our country goes through a renewed emphasis on how we might overcome racism, I once again turn to the noteworthy quote by the author James Baldwin that surely can help guide us. He says, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." That's our reminder that in order for us to change the future, we must continue to face our history, both long past and still current. And that's where our conversation will again begin tonight. So now I pass it off to Jerry, who's magically going to appear on screen, and he'll tell us a little bit about how this particular project came about and introduce our moderator. Welcome, Jerry. Please take it away.
Hi, thank you, Lori. It's my pleasure to speak once again to a very large audience that I'm thrilled is joining us when we run these programs. I want to tell you a little bit about how this all came about. For those of you that have been on the other two, I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself, but there'll be some new people here. Many, many years ago, there was a movement to deny that the Holocaust really happened. And the Jewish Federation mobilized through the Strauchlitz Holocaust Resource Center a program called Encountering Survivors, where we had survivors living in Eastern Connecticut going into classrooms, meeting with students, and eventually meeting in small groups where the students came to the homes of the survivors and learned of their stories. Then there were a series of racist incidents at athletic games that New London High School athletic teams were playing, basketball, football, and even others. that were not adequately responded to by the community. In addition to that, there were, and unfortunately still are, racial incidents happening on campuses in high schools around the area. So we decided to take the model of encountering survivors and bring it to the issue of encountering differences, and have students go to African American homes and learn the history of 3, 4, 5 different African American families and meet with them in their homes. The key was, in both encountering survivors and in encountering differences, to meet with them in their homes so that people would become comfortable getting to know Jewish people and spending time with African Americans. It worked very well. And we asked the Palmer Fund to help us underwrite an exhibit that we were to mount at the Lyman Allen Museum. And the Lyman Allen Museum was very gracious and enthusiastic about doing this. And I want to thank Sam Quigley and Jane LeGros, who were instrumental in getting the exhibit up in February. And I want to thank Todd Gibstein, who really helped us shape the panels and do the graphics for the exhibit, which will be on display at La Grua until December 19th. So you can go and see it Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 10 to 2. We're planning to have the exhibit continue at Connecticut College on their campus as soon as the campus can be open to the general community. The opening at the Lyman Allen was just exceptional. It was a gigantic crowd, and many people came to see the exhibit before we were forced to curtail and actually stop visits because of the pandemic. Helping me set up this exhibit was Tammy Kay, who coordinates all of our school activities. She is the backbone of both of our Encountering Survivors and Encountering Difference programs. And I'm thrilled that she's now working with teachers in Stonington and North Stonington to bring them into these programs as well. I don't have enough good words to say about tonight's moderator, Lisa McGinley. Aside from being a good personal friend of mine, she's a member of the editorial board and a contributing editorial writer and columnist for the day newspaper of New London. In her last decade of employment at the paper, she served as city editor and supervised coverage of all the breaking and developing news throughout southeastern Connecticut. She retired 4 years ago from full-time journalism, but still serves on the paper's editorial board and writes editorials and op-ed pieces on a regular basis. In the late 1990s, American journalism recognized that religious beliefs and practices were key to understanding much of what happens in our society. Freedom of religion, the civil rights movement, the death penalty, and the emerging awareness of clergy sex abuse and abortion rights were all deeply influenced by religious beliefs, as were the extremist beliefs that led to the terror attacks of 9/11/2001. The Day, as well as many other papers, responded by initiating full-time coverage of religion. And Lisa was the first reporter on the Day to hold that beat, and also edited a weekly section of the newspaper titled Beliefs. That's the reason why she's an excellent moderator for tonight's discussion. She currently, by the way, is active in many volunteer capacities, including being president of the Board of Trustees of the Lyman Allen Museum, the museum that kicked off this wonderful exhibit, Stories of Resilience. A lifelong Catholic, she serves as a lector and Eucharistic minister at St. Joseph's Church and is an assistant presiding officer at the historic Pequot Chapel in New London. It's my pleasure to introduce Lisa McKenzie.
Thank you very much, Jerry. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Just 1 second here. We are particularly grateful to the Grua Center for hosting this panel on racism and the response of faith. It is a great service to the community of Southeastern Connecticut that the Stories of Resilience exhibition is appearing, particularly because it focuses on 5 heroes among us, all of whom have persevered in carrying out lives of service despite the irrational response of racism in our society. Our panelists this evening lead 3 local congregations that are visibly active in social justice issues. My task is to pose questions for each of them and allow opportunities for an exchange of views. And if there is time at the end, we will hear some questions sent in by listeners. During the preparation for tonight's panel, the Reverend Lloyd McKenzie commented that in his experience of serving congregations in the Midwest and elsewhere in Connecticut, he finds our community to be unique. Here he sees an openness of people to one another that he has not found everywhere. I expect he will tell us more about that. The Reverend Lloyd McKenzie Jr. is a native of Brownsville, Pennsylvania. He studied at the University of Akron and at the Bible Training Institute in Cleveland, Tennessee. While serving in the ministry, he simultaneously had a career in the IT industry until retirement in 2017. The Reverend McKenzie says that the passion that pushes his ministry is strengthening God's kingdom and serving his people. He has served in Milwaukee, Kansas City, and Boston. In Connecticut, he served the United Church of Christ in Hartford and AME Zion congregations in Danbury and Windsor. He is currently at Walls Clarke Temple AME Zion Church in New London. Welcome, Reverend McKenzie.
Thank you.
A prime example of the openness and welcoming of others is exemplified in the outreach activities of All Souls Unitarian Universalist congregation in New London under the leadership of the Reverend Carolyn Patierno. Reverend Carolyn has served the All Souls congregation since 2001. She is one of the founders of the Homeless Hospitality Center, is active in the Greater New London Clergy Association, and serves on the Immigration Advocacy and Support Center's Board of Directors. She has long been an activist dedicating her efforts to peace, racial, gender, and LGBTQ equity, and immigration and refugee justice. She lives in New London with her spouse, Kate Stafford. Welcome, Reverend Carolyn. Completing our panel and expanding the geography of this discussion is Rabbi Jeremy Schwartz, the spiritual leader of Temple Bnai Israel in Willimantic since 2000. As we were preparing for this panel, he reflected that Jewish history shares the burden of enslavement and the feeling of being outsiders that affect race relations between whites and people of color today. Rabbi Schwartz is a graduate of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. His wide range of teaching interests includes particular emphasis on ethical self-improvement and tikkun olam, the concept of repairing the world. Rabbi Schwartz restarted the clergy group of the Windham Area Interfaith Ministry when he came to Willimantic and has been very involved in the Windham Region Interfaith Working Group. Welcome, Rabbi Schwartz.
Thanks so much.
All right, we are happy to get started, and I am going to pose the first question to all 3 participants, and I think we'll start with Carolyn, but it applies to everyone. Be sure you unmute yourselves when you're ready to answer. We know your current role, but we would like you to please tell us how you came to be a religious leader and one who is engaged in social activism.
Thank you, Lisa. You, of course, spend 4 years of seminary learning how to answer that question. So I will do so in a nutshell. Prior to seminary, I worked in the AIDS movement, and I worked for a national organization and had the great honor of traveling all over the country and offering HIV prevention education and advocacy as well. I did that for 10 years. And at the end of those years, my closest friend died of AIDS-related illnesses. And I felt like I was very much at a crossroad. At that point, I recognized that I had a nagging sense of call for a long time. And it was time to reckon with that call and eventually answer that call. And so when I did, and when I took steps to get myself and my family to California, where I attended seminary, I came from a background of activism. And so that transition from secular life and secular career really led me to clergy, to religious life. And you don't leave that part of yourself behind. You bring those experiences and commitments with you. So my life as an activist continued. And fortunately for me, I stand in a tradition where that is an important aspect of who we are. I know we'll talk more about that momentarily.
Thank you. Reverend McKenzie, would you be able to answer the same question? Do you want me to repeat it? You need to be there. There you go.
Oh, I've got the question. I thank you, Lisa.
Okay.
And good evening to everyone. My experience goes back to my young adulthood. I was engaged in evolving levels of service in the church for a long time, and I took it quite seriously. And I found a very deep fulfillment in the work that was going on in the church. As time went on and I grew in knowledge and a deepening spirituality, I recognized the pull or the draw, or the call, as Carolyn mentioned. And I recognized that there would be an incompleteness in me without the aiding and nurturing of humanity. So I found that attending to the well-being of God's people requires activism, and passivity just does not get it done. So therefore, I became engaged on a number of levels. Of course, I had mentors along the line, various religious leaders, and some family members. But the draw from within by the Spirit is what prompted me to make the necessary preparations and position myself to serve the kingdom here on earth.
Thank you. Rabbi Schwartz.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I want to say again, I want to start with my childhood, actually, without taking all evening, getting from there to now. But really, I grew up in a family and was and in a youth movement called Habonim that were both very invested, both in Jewish identity, not particularly religious identity, but our cultural, ethnic identity as a people, as a community, and in social justice. And that stuck with me throughout. While I was in this not necessarily religious youth group, I was also very involved in a synagogue. And I remember, even as a young person, I'm a leader of a liberal congregation. So we don't take the Bible as perfect truth, perfect revelation of God's word, but as our striving toward God. And even as a young person, I had that sense, but I also had a sense that there was deep truth in what I was hearing. I remember very specifically one day when the 10 Commandments were chanted from the Torah in synagogue, and the chanter said in Hebrew, "You shall not murder," and I thought, okay, that's just true. That's God, the universe, however I'm going to understand truth, it's true. And encountered the awe and the call and the sense of oneness behind everything in those youthful days, as well as the social justice, the identity. But I resisted the rabbinate, actually, even though people in my synagogue said, "Oh, Jeremy, you should be a rabbi." I thought, well, you know, there should be also educated, involved Jews who aren't rabbis. You know, I'm going to do this and that. I thought I would help the world and do holy work as an economist, actually, helping the poor, maybe being involved in development economics. And so I studied economics undergrad. I worked towards a PhD in economics that I never finished because the model of a human being in your standard economics program is a very efficient greed machine. And my religious self knew that that wasn't what a human being was, that we were something very different. People who were loving and created community and made choices and actually weren't that efficient and rational at even the kind of base self-satisfaction that economics talks about. So in the midst of that dissatisfaction, I also happened to be getting ready to get married and fell in love again with our people's traditions and texts and teachings, and found myself in the Cornell Library all day reading liturgy. And I said, well, you know what? There's something else maybe I should do. And the things that I even enjoyed in my grad school program were community organizing and bringing people together and doing some kind of moral leadership with my friends and colleagues. So Jewish texts and moral community leadership pretty much said, okay, stop resisting, apply to rabbinical school. Here I am.
Thank you. Thank you. In both the civil rights movement and the abolitionist movement leading up to the Civil War, clergy and believers played key roles in leadership and in getting people out to demonstrate for justice. All three of our panelists represent faith traditions that share a commitment to taking care of our neighbor and a belief in justice and in mercy. We all know that those commitments represent goals and that human beings often fall short. Reverend McKenzie, can you please tell us more about the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church and how social engagement is part of the mission of the church?
Certainly. The African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church had its origin in 1796. It is indeed an offshoot of Methodism from its originator, John Wesley. However, in the Amy Zion experience, we were part of the John Street Church, John Street Methodist Church in New York. And that fellowship was predominantly white, and the African American population was growing. However, there were rules, there were restrictions. The members and the clergy of that church, which were African American, had limitations on what they could do. Worship was separate. Often the Holy Communion was given separately. Those ministers who had been called and prepared, there was reluctance to ordain them. So it was decided that the people of color would withdraw from the John Street Methodist Church and establish what was then called Zion Chapel, what is now called Mother Zion, which is the first and original church of the African Methodist Episcopal Zion connection. And it is in Harlem. So that is our roots. And it is based on moving toward justice from injustice, moving toward equity from inequity. So it is clearly a part of our DNA. in the church's mission statement, there's a statement that reads, "We believe that the church should have a positive relationship to God vertically and a positive relationship to humankind horizontally." So all people being equal. So in the AME Zion Church, yes, we are heavily engaged in social change. In fact, the AME Zion Church is known as, and proudly known as, the Freedom Church. So we have these things as our history, and we carry that forth today across the connection.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Mhm.
Reverend Carolyn, could you please tell us about the relationship between politics and religion in the Unitarian Universalist tradition and the role of social activism?
Sure. Lloyd, I just want to say thank you. That was so interesting. I didn't know that original origin story. So thank you for that. I want to learn more. So Unitarian Universalism is a covenantal faith and not a creedal faith. And so we covenant to live guided by 7 principles. And of those 7 principles, I want to share 3 with you. One is justice, equity, and compassion in human relationships. Another is the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. And the third is the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process. So our commitment to justice and equity and peace is woven into, as my colleague said, into our DNA. And in addition, an 8th principle has been proposed to be added to the existing 7 that says that we will promote journeying towards spiritual wholeness by building a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and in our institutions. So we will, as a body, be voting on this proposed 8th principle. But again, it just boosts what has existed for more than a generation among us. So those values are ones that anyone who is entering into the faith becomes very well aware of right out of the gate. It is something that we are not shy about. On contrary, it's something that we feel just committed to and proud of, and to be led by that is to give us not only permission, but the courage to act out our faith, to have it so explicitly articulated for us within those 7 principles. So that is the cornerstone of how we conduct ourselves. And then, of course, what is then important is to act, to not just feel good about these principles, but to do things that change systems. The previous panel talked very clearly about how we can't just be talking about action, we have to do it. So emboldened by these explicit values, we do things that that I think some faith communities might feel is going out on a limb, and for All Souls, it is our just simply doing what we covenant with each other to do.
Thank you. Thank you. Rabbi Jeremy.
Thanks. So you asked about Reconstructionism particularly. So the Reconstructionist movement is a fairly young movement of Judaism. It was and small. It was started in the 1920s and 30s by Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan, who had the the insight that Judaism could be described as a civilization, as something more than a religion, but a whole community's way of life. Actually, an insight that can be applied to a lot of things, and that Jews have always reconstructed their religion, even though they, over the millennia, would say, well, actually, this is what God told Moses at Sinai, and it's been the same all the time. But Kaplan said, if you look at the record, actually, it's changed every time, every generation, and we're going to say out loud that we're reconstructing Judaism. It's been small but influential. And I also want to, because I'm the only rabbi on the panel, I want to say something about Judaism in general too, that activism and justice work has been part of the Jewish tradition since the beginning, since biblical insistence on the rights of the poor and the powerless and the stranger, and that our history as Jews has really resulted in our engagement in the last centuries in many movements for social justice. The labor movement had an overabundance of Jewish leaders. Civil rights movement as well. Some people might know that the NAACP, among its founders and leaders, were Jewish folks, that the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act in the 60s were actually drafted. The physical drafting took place at the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, their kind of social justice center, by the leaders that were gathered there. So a long history. And in our denomination in particular, this notion of civilizational Judaism puts an emphasis that the individual is part of a social society, and that for individuals to flourish, the society has to be working for them and empowering them when maybe its society is not empowering them. And so that's given us a long history of social justice orientation, about democracy also, like the Unitarians, about women's rights, LGBTQ rights we've been at the forefront of, and especially interfaith dialogue.
Thank you. Thank you. We're going to move to what your congregations are doing right now about racism and other important issues of justice and the needs facing our country. Do you mostly experience unity or disunity within the congregation? In other words, do members of your own congregation and the leadership of your larger ecclesiastical body disagree or even criticize attempts to get involved, or are they supportive and pulling in the same direction? Rabbi Schwartz, would you start with that?
Sure, thanks. I was going to say, to the question of what's your congregation doing, I'm on sabbatical now, actually, so I have no idea, but that's not really completely true. I am on sabbatical. The congregation mostly works through informal and formal relationships and coalitions with others. So we've over the last few years, we've been in relationship with the Willimantic NAACP. They've done this wonderful movie series to encourage conversation around issues of racism and discrimination generally. They showed Jerry Fisher's movie actually as one of the movies that they showed, and just various conversations with them and working with them. Building relationships, I think, is so important. I'm going to come back to that, I think, in our conversation later. We have this interfaith working group that our congregation was active in starting in the Windham and Mansfield area. We're involved in the Quiet Corner refugee resettlement. So it's those sorts of things that we do. Internally, we have a Holocaust and Human Rights Committee, the Hochberg Committee, and a Tikkun Olam, a World Repair Committee that are working on these issues. Mostly, I think it's been, people have been cool with that they expect that of our, of a Jewish organization. Once in a while, we do get pushback, you know. I gave a pretty strong racism, anti-racism high holiday sermon a couple years ago, and there was at least one person who called and said, you know, well, what about all lives matter, and why do you have to talk about, you know, so there's some pushback. We wanted to have some banners about we stand with our Muslim neighbors, and you know, we had members who were on the kind of, you know, which Muslim neighbors, and there are Muslim extremists, and you know, so sometimes we have to work through those things. But we do. We find what our core values are, and I think people actually agree more than they realize they do. They have some very deep core values about loving their neighbors and about human rights, human dignity. And if we can go back to that, I think we can. You know,
that would be great. Thank you. Thank you. I hope we will go back to that. Reverend McKenzie, would you take up that question?
Yes. I'll first highlight that as a connection, the Amy Zion Church has a Christian education department that publishes our Sunday school literature. And we have of late been dealing with lessons and discussions around loving equitably. And this is, first, I'm pleased that the leadership is looking at this, and the way the lessons are designed allows us to engage across the globe in the church on this subject matter, and to take deep dives into really what this means biblically and how we can apply it in our communities today.
Mm-hmm.
On a more local level, it gives me an opportunity to highlight one of the celebrants of the exhibit that was already talked about earlier by Jerry, and that is our own Reverend Clarke at the Clarke Temple Church, who is engaged in that resilience program. We have the administrative assistant at the church who has a very profound interest and engaged in senior wellness in the community. The local church supports a family shelter for families that have been victimized on a number of levels. And overall, we want to and make it a point of presenting ourselves as open and willing and available to discussions like this, and where we have opportunity to make a difference in the immediate community and the broader community as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Reverend Carolyn.
Unitarian Universalist governance, our polity is congregational. And so each individual congregation gets to determine their present and their future. However, we have a strong and vocal mothership, the Unitarian Universal Association, who in 2017 began to speak about dismantling white supremacy. And they encouraged all congregations in our movement at that time to engage in a white supremacy teach-in that would take place on a Sunday morning during worship services. It would be a worship service. And when this is way before anybody was using the phrase white supremacy to apply to congregations like the one I serve. And my head spun and I thought, okay, how am I gonna sell this to this congregation of progressive folks who believe they're doing the right thing? And of course, now it's common parlance that many of us have come to understand that white supremacy is in the air we breathe. It's deep in the systems that both built our country and remain in the systems today. And so that was an important first step for us to look inward and understand that in a way that we had not prior to that, despite the decades of anti-racism work and learning that we had engaged in. So that was an eye opener for us, and we have built our work upon that learning ever since. So in 2015, just prior to that, there were a series of violence in Black communities, and the advocates were asking that majority white congregations take it upon themselves to become reliable allies. And one of the ways to do that, we were asked to put ourselves out there and express our commitment to Black lives specifically. And so we got a big old banner, it's 6 feet long, and we hung it at the front of the sanctuary. And every Sunday we went out between between services and did a public witness, a Black Lives Matter public witness. And we do that as much to for ourselves, to strengthen our own resolve for these issues, and to learn through the response of the people who pass by, both people of color, Black people of color, and Indigenous folks, and to see their reaction to that, that perhaps this is a reliable place where they could go and be seen and supported and held, basically. So that has continued. Everything has slowed down because of COVID, but in this time, we are, as far as changing systems are concerned, we have about a couple dozen people in the congregation who are deeply involved in the Get Out the Vote effort, trying to change systems within the system that we have of democracy, again, honoring our values. We do postcard campaigns on a whole range of issues. And in general, to answer very quickly, I know my time is ending, I serve a congregation that is pretty much behind these efforts. I don't hear about a lot of pushback, which isn't to say there are questions, there isn't discomfort, but I'm fortunate that I serve a congregation that's very committed to these issues.
And the community is fortunate to have these congregations as well. This is another question for all three of you, and I would start with Reverend McKenzie. Could you tell us, as spiritual leaders, if there are words from the Bible or another sacred or special text that you cite as you try to inspire your congregants and our country to a more perfect world? And would you share those with us?
There are. I couldn't begin identifying any words without stopping first at the word Christ or Christian. The word Christian is only used a couple of times in the Bible, but signifying Christ-like. I try to stress that so that it reminds us how we should be governing our lives. A more particular word is compassion. Compassion, I looked at this, it's used 71 times in the Bible in 67 different verses, but it goes from the very beginning of the Old Testament through the New Testament. And Christ used it himself a lot. And I find he was driven by compassion that allowed him to minister to everybody, regardless of status, condition, everybody. That kind of compassion, I believe, does, and will make the kind of difference that we need made in our world today. And finally, the word harmony. In Romans 12 and 16, it tells us, live in harmony with one another. Plain and simple. If we could make it a reality, we would make huge strides in this. So between compassion and harmony, we could stay very busy.
Thank you. Thank you. Rabbi Schwartz, would you like to take that?
Yeah, those are wonderful. I kind of want to just stop compassion and harmony. Let's do it. There's so many. I mentioned the interfaith working group, and so and the banners that we were discussing about our Muslim neighbors in 2015 and 16, leading up to that election. There was so much toxic talk in our society about others. It's this us and them thing, as if we weren't one human family. Muslim others, Hispanic others, foreigners of every sort, religious others, and so the group, it's one of its first important things was a program of distributing banners to faith communities and lawn signs to individual homes. And you ask about words from the Bible. We got around the objections to the language that we had originally thought of for our banner by going to the biblical sources. And so the banner that we ended up with said, "Love the stranger," from Deuteronomy, from the Hebrew scriptures, and "Make strangers welcome," from Hebrews in the New Testament, and "Do good to the stranger," from the Quran. So yeah, our sources help us. There's so many others. The image of God, humanity made in the image of God, is a very important teaching that inspires us in the Jewish tradition from Genesis. Love your neighbor as yourself. Which also, by the way, people don't realize that passage in Leviticus starts, "Don't hate your neighbor, reprove your neighbor." Right? There's a whole process. We might be angry, we might be hurt, but there's a process to move away from hatred toward love. So that justice shall you pursue. Do not stand idly by the blood of your neighbor. That's been important for us this summer. I think that a lot of rabbis were teaching that after the murder of George Floyd, and using that as a core teaching. And there's a whole kind of third creation story that comes out of our mystical tradition in the 15th, 16th century, actually, about God creating the universe and some kind of explosion on the universe that leaves little sparks of the divine everywhere. And it's actually out of that this phrase that some people know, Tikkun Olam, repairing the world, comes. This creation story of the world as shattered, but containing the divine. And our work is to put it back together and to discover that godly light and make it more and more revealed and more united in the world. That's a very powerful image, I think, for our Jewish communities.
It's very powerful indeed. Reverend Carolyn.
So Unitarian Universalism, we have a large, broad opportunities to draw from different sources that we understand as sacred. But I want to address what I have been using and depending and leaning on in my ministry and personally as well since the election in 2016. So devastated, the folks that I serve and so many beyond. And that was two things. One is a poem by William Wordsworth entitled "The World is Too Much With Us." And he uses a phrase in that poem. He says that we lay waste our power. We lay waste our power. And I turned that around a little bit and shared with the good people I serve that we cannot lay waste our power in the 4 years that we were facing. And that we would not relinquish our power out of a feeling of despair or hopelessness. You know, I really felt like that was going to be what paralyzed us at a time that we could ill afford to be paralyzed. And I hold close the words of Representative John Lewis, who in his last words to us before he died were that we could not let despair get the best of us. We had to power through that despair. So we will not lay waste our power has been a phrase that I shared in 2016 right after the election, and the week before the 2020 election, I reminded myself and those I serve of those words. You know, that no matter how this turns out, we're going to have a lot of work to do. And so there's been that. And then that old spiritual that then became a union and civil rights song, We Shall Not Be Moved. We sang that song the Sunday after the election in 2016. I played the Staples Singers version, and Mavis Staples, that beautiful alto voice. We listened to it, we learned it, and we sing that song for strength and to say, like a tree planted by the water, we shall not be moved. And what I love about that song is that it's we shall not be moved. You know, it is a reminder that none of us stand on the banks of that river alone. And if you are part of a faith community, you are reminded of that. And that is what I think one of the great power of being part of a faith community is, that you feel like you are not alone in using your power to heal and not to harm, to bless and not to curse. We borrow from the Jewish tradition as we say those words together. So those are the two that I have leaned on most in the past 4 years. And I think I will continue to lean on them in the 4 years to come. We've got a lot of work to do.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to split up the questions here and ask a little different one of each of the panelists. And I'm going to start again with Rabbi Schwartz. Religion is not growing as a significant factor in the lives of many Americans. Do you think faith communities are in the best position to respond to the crisis in race relations? Are there steps that you hope the larger mainstream religious denominations and congregations might take to help?
If we only knew all those answers. You know, I think it's clear, you know, as we've watched over the last year and more, several years, there are a lot of bits of our American community that are coming together and moving us forward. I think about the young people and how much I've taught several times that they're the prophets. Listen to them, you know, from the Parkland kids and the climate folks and Greta Thunberg's. So faith communities don't have a monopoly, you know, and the Black Lives Matter folks this summer and before that. But I think we have an important role. Our society is so fragmented and so individualized, and faith communities are among the last remaining kind of organized civic spaces where people come together. And the only way to change is for people to come together and exercise their democratic power together. And so for that reason, faith communities are very, very important, I think. They're just an organizing location. And the other reason is because so many of these questions are the questions that religion is designed to address. Reverend Patierno talked about, you know, citing John Lewis, talked about some of that despair. How do we hope in the world? What is it to be a human being? What's the right thing to do? And you know, and faith brings us to that. It opens us up to those possibilities to hope. So I think we have an important role, and how, well, organizing internally and with each other, meeting each other, offering the spiritual and intellectual and material support. Reverend McKenzie talked about the education programs coming out of their denomination, for example, and the materials that push us too. I read Pope Francis's op-ed this last Sunday in the New York Times. So, yeah. You know, I didn't grow up like thinking I'm going to be inspired by the Pope. It's quite wonderful that we're in a world where that can happen, where so many of us of so many traditions are inspired, but also pushed. You know, there were pieces of his teaching that said, okay, remember, Rabbi Schwartz, remember to see the real faces, not to get stuck in your abstractions. Remember to be in solidarity with the disempowered. And our faiths do that. They push us, and we have to keep pushing, and our leaders have to keep pushing and supporting us. The other thing they do is they amplify our voices. I know that in the Reconstructionist and Reform movement, and in Judaism especially, that's part of what our denominations do. They make sure that all the millions of us have our voice heard in Washington and in New York, where big decisions are being made.
Really, really good points. Thank you. Reverend Carolyn, you are welcome to pick up on some of those points, but would you also address the famous comment which was said during the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s, that Sunday morning in America is our most segregated hour? How should we react to that?
Dr. King said that, and I think there's no other way to react but to say he was right then, and were he still alive, he would be right today. I mean, that is absolutely true. I think all three of us on this panel serve congregations that are pretty homogeneous, you know, and what is that about? I think it is an incredibly complicated question. I think part of the congregation I serve, part of our effort in talking about white supremacy within the church, within the structure that is All Souls, is to make it more possible for Black, people of color, Indigenous folks to feel at home without unintended, but nevertheless, microaggressions that might happen to them being at All Souls. And I also, you know, many of us read Brian Stevenson's book, Just Mercy. And I take to heart what he said, that proximate, you know, we have to be in proximity with people in order to build the relationships that Rabbi Schwartz talked about, that Reverend McKenzie has talked about, that part of what we need to do is to build relationships and therefore build trust and mutual respect, that we can be in each other's company without being always nervous about either saying the wrong thing or being the recipient of something that is hurtful, and so therefore badgering the kind of trust that we need to live together. And I also think that people on Sunday, on Saturday, on Friday night, they want to be comfortable. You know, people want to be comfortable. They want to be at ease. And at this point in our history, and I hope that I live to see the day when this is no longer true, people are more at ease, from junior high kids sitting at cafeteria tables with kids who look just like them, through adulthood. We are still in this culture, in this country, more comfortable with the people who we feel we know and therefore can spend time with in this way. So we keep working. And I don't know that this is going to change in my lifetime, as I said, but it doesn't mean that we're going to stop trying.
Thank you. Reverend McKenzie, Again, you're welcome to respond to the comments that your colleagues have made, but would you also please talk about how your faith has enabled you to endure the difficult times that our country has endured, and the appropriation of religious symbols by bigots such as white supremacists? And of course, we all know the most egregious of those is the burning of crosses on somebody's lawn or burning down a church. Would you please talk about that?
I am glad to hear there is a common, glad but not surprised. And these are the things that happen when they're dialogue. We see our commonalities.
Mm-hmm.
There is a pursuit for truth among us this evening. And that warms my heart and encourages me to let's keep on doing this at whatever venue we have so that we can gain ground in that. Lisa, I would not just say my faith, but I must reference the faith of the congregation that I serve.
Mm-hmm.
The Wallscar Temple Church is an incredible group of people steeped in struggle, witnesses to overcoming, and together this faith has allowed us to and pushed us to endure the difficult times that we've had. What we together trust in is the sovereignty of our God. We realize He is in control. A lot of it we don't understand. A lot of it, if He had checked with us first, things would be different. But we do trust in His providence, and we trust in His promise that He is going to take care of His people. So, yes, there's a lot to be done. We see His permissive will, where there are those persons who do these horrible things. I recognize and we recognize that we cannot change that, but our faith in the promises of God is what carries us through. And we make it our business to want to be a part of the solution and not participate in the problem of it.
Those are very inspiring words from all of you. Rabbi Schwartz, you didn't get a chance to respond to what they said. Would you like a couple of minutes for that?
No, Reverend McKenzie said we should keep doing it. That's right. I mean, the Pope ends his thing, his article talking about solidarity, and you don't build that, just by saying the word. You build it by meeting each other, and that's, in fact, that's what we've been doing in our interfaith work. The panels, praying together, eating together, now Zooming together, unfortunately. Marching together, and learning from each other. It's important, and it becomes a tool too. I don't remember exactly what Reverend McKenzie said, but something that he said made me want to talk about my friend Ahmed. So the co-chair of our interfaith group up here is Ahmed Çalar, Muslim, originally from Turkey. And I had all kinds of, peaceful sentiments before, but now, when my anti-Muslim cousin posts things on Facebook, it's very different when I can say, well, how about my friend Ahmed? Mm-hmm. And so the real meeting, I think, is so important.
And that's come through with everything you've all said. The next question is for all of you again, and it's a long question. You may make any kind of length out of the answers that you've been thinking about, but I will read it. We have in the past decades been confronted with horrible killings of African American men and women at the hands of white police officers. These deaths have galvanized much of our country and led both to large peaceful protests and some riots and violence. They have resulted in broad support for the Black Lives Matter movement, as well as putting race relations at the forefront of political discourse. I will ask each of you how your faith has helped you and your congregants to navigate the past year. And you've touched on some of that before, but this last year has been extraordinary, and it might be that there's been something special to mention about that. Do you think the Black Lives Matter movement will continue to have broad support? Do you have hope for that? And that Americans of all backgrounds will see progress in the elimination of racism in the near future, even steps in progress? And what are the next important steps to be taken? I think, Carolyn, it's your turn to be first.
So I'll just take pieces of this. So the first time that I saw many of the folks that I serve who are part of All Souls in person since March was at the march, the demonstration that took place in the wake of George Floyd's murder. And it was heartening to see that so many decided that risk was important enough to mask up, distance as best they could, and show up. You know, there were 1,000 people in New London in the wake of that terrible, terrible event. So I was heartened that that there was as much support as there was, not just from All Souls, but from the wider community, and that we were being led by young people, by Hearing Youth Voices. That's the name of the organization that they organized, that grown-ups were wise enough to get out of their way and just do what was asked of us, finally. And they did a beautiful job. It was inspiring to see what they did. So as I said, I was heartened. What is disheartening is and I know Tamara Lanier spoke about this at your last panel, is the disinformation, the propaganda that has been unleashed upon us since then, under the guise of law and order. And we've seen support for the Black Lives Matter movement actually ebb since its height in May. And so I think our work now is to bring those folks back, to push back on this disinformation that is clearly not going to go away. It's not going to be silenced or even quieted after this administration is done. So my faith has helped me in all to take the muslin from my eyes, and I see that this is propaganda. I have the courage to show up when I'm asked to show up, and to shut up when I'm asked to shut up, and to support the congregation I serve in doing the same. So as far as next steps are concerned, you know, democracy, I keep saying democracy is not a spectator sport. And if we haven't learned anything else other than that, these past 4 years, it might be enough that we have to stay vigilant in this time, led by our faith. I appreciate that, Rabbi Schwartz, that you talked about. It may look like religious life in American life is receding, but in fact, these are the central questions that faith can help us communicate and dialogue around and come together on these questions of despair and how do you keep hope kindled? How do we welcome the stranger? Why is that important? And so I think if we center those questions faithfully within the context of the traditions we represent, it will help. I have to believe that it will help.
Reverend McKenzie, do you believe it will help?
I do. There's so much to this. I need to mention, Lisa, as you read the question and revisited the societal issues, I was reminded of the universal pain that we all experienced. And I'm sure as congregational leaders, you felt it and working to lead the congregation, yet how this pain has galvanized all of us to a point of coming together. And I believe firmly that the Black Lives Matter movement and associated energies will continue, largely because, as Rabbi Schwartz pointed out earlier, there is an exceptional amount of young people involvement here, and not just cheering, but as Pastor Carol said, organizing, directing, saying, come on, let's do this. And if I can support that and promote it, then there's promise of future here. In terms of next steps, I'll just touch on something that was just mentioned, and that is our participation and engagement in this country's processes, the political process, the economical process, the educational, the humanitarian process. As persons of faith, we have a biblical, spiritual obligation not to remove ourselves from the mess, but to engage in reparations, increasing understanding. So I have faith to believe that, yes, it's going to get better, but it's going to take all of us staying engaged and helping those that are coming along to become engaged. Yes, I'm optimistic.
Could I ask you to reflect just a little on the comment that I referred to in the introduction when we were preparing for this, and you talked about this community? You had nice observation as a person who's been all over the country almost, seeing lots of congregations. Do you see something specific about here that gives you hope?
You know, it is kind of understood we don't see ourselves as well as the same way that other people see us. As mentioned, I've lived in different parts of the country, not just the geographics, but the cultures as well. And it has some to do with ethnicity, race, and those things, but there is a result of the blending of a culture. You can blend it, but what you come out with varies from time to time. In the Greater New London community, what I've recognized, there's a tremendous amount of diversity, but the blending that has happened prior to my coming and what I've seen in my years here has produced or gelled to something positive. Still working out the kinks and wrinkles, but there's a willingness to be at the table. Everybody looks different, everybody talks different, but there's a willingness to look at our positives, look at our opportunities, and go forward. I submit, as I said in our discussion a couple of weeks ago, it's not everywhere, and the Greater New London community should be grateful. Don't slow up. Don't take a breath and say, all right, we're ahead of the curve. No, that's
No.
not the issue. It is a blessing. And I think God's hand has been upon this community in a particular way. Persons present and many others have followed the leading of our Creator in the right direction. And I just hope to be a part of that as we go forward.
Could not hope for anything better. Thank you. Rabbi Schwartz, would you take up the same question from your perspective?
Thanks. I mentioned this creation story of the shattered world with divine sparks in it, and it occurs to me that Christianity could tell that story and does tell that story in a different way, but somehow there's a parallel thing about the brokenness in the world and the God within it, and that we're the bridge, and that whole story gives me hope. You know, it says, okay, I don't have to despair when things go wrong. You know, certain religious streams would say nothing's wrong, just some things are challenging to us. But when things go wrong, I don't despair, because I know, okay, this is this world, and there's God in it. We can respond with love and justice and solidarity, and it's been so moving to see so many people doing that. I've been thinking during this conversation about the service that our congregation held after the shooting of the synagogue in Pittsburgh, and in a weird way, it was one of the most beautiful times of my rabbinate here. 300 people in my congregation, Muslim students from Yukon that when I came here 20 years ago, you know, wouldn't pick up the phone. Our Christian friends, our Black friends. Somehow we have been learning. Maybe it's the hand of God on us, like Reverend Lloyd says. Somehow we've been learning through the pain, and our faith helps us to turn that pain into love, and it's quite amazing. You know, everything is 2 steps forward, 1 step back. All of these movements, you know. I mentioned Parkland, you know, and we were all sure after the shooting at Sandy Hook, things are going to change, and our hearts are 100% in this, you know. And after Parkland, and you make some progress, and then life goes on, and people forget, and they get busy, and you know. So there's a little bit of that, but I don't think that's also a reason for despair. People have taken on learning. People have had their eyes opened a bit more. There's some place where they weren't a year ago. And even if the passion isn't there, still we've all learned things that we didn't know a year ago, and have been called in ways that we didn't know we were called. And so, right. As both my colleagues have said, the thing is to keep answering that call, however we to keep meeting each other and to keep learning. I think the movement in some ways is in what are actually the achievable gains? How are we going to implement our police review board here in Willimantic, which was one of the changes that came up here. How will it have actual teeth to make things different? So, what are achievable gains locally and nationally and in the state, and working on that, and then continue. The thing is always to build the relationships, continue organizing with each other, learning each other's stories, and learning the power that we have together.
Thank you. Is there anything that any one of you want to add? We're going to ask Jerry if he has any questions from listeners, but is there anything before that that you'd like to say that you didn't have the opportunity to, or address to the group that's listening? It's been wonderful. You've done a marvelous job of talking with reference to each other so that we could all get a feeling of the unity behind this. The words that came up very often, relationships and compassion, etc. So I'm going to thank you for your participation and contributions to this symposium. You've done a wonderful job. And I'm going to shout out to the darkness on my screen. Jerry, do you have any questions from the group that you want to present? I think we lost him.
Yeah, Jerry just disappeared just at the wrong
Hey,
moment.
just at that moment, yeah. Jerry, this is your big moment.
Well, if he's disappeared, I'll jump in here and offer
Okay.
a couple of questions. Someone has asked, she said, many religious leaders spoke publicly against racism earlier this year, but not sure many politicians listened. Who do you yourself hope to reach as you speak about this? Oh, there he is. Go ahead. Any of you? I think any or all of you? Had to get politics in there somewhere.
I think politics has been shot all through this conversation, actually. Yeah, Reverend McKenzie, go ahead.
I was only going to say legislators and policymakers are the persons that I would love to reach. Those that are establishing the guides for our society and our operation.
Okay.
Including, I think it's easy to forget because of all the tumult of national politics, but a lot of change is made locally.
Right.
And a lot of people just got reelected to the state legislature. And so, and they passed a police accountability reform bill that will be up for further developing. You know, some of its proposals were put into study groups, et cetera. So there is opportunity to get to people who are not very far away. They're not in Washington, and what they do can affect lives right here in Connecticut, where policing will have to be part of, you know, in cooperation with that law or in observance of that law. Jerry or Lori.
I was knocked off of the internet for a minute or two. So I just want to say that this was a remarkable symposium, and thank you all for your participation. It was inspiring to me, and I think it was inspiring to everybody. It sounds like Lori got to ask the first question. I think I'll ask the second question, which is, how do you all feel about President-elect Biden's choices, both in terms of gender and race, for his government? And if you think it gives us hope for a better future in our country and a more harmonious next 4 years.
The other day I was in the car and I was listening to public radio on the day that President-elect Biden was introducing, I believe, 7 of his officers or nominees. And post his speech and the speeches of those named, the journalists, as they often do, were reviewing and critiquing. And what I heard them say, they were also stunned at the language that was being used. Things like working together, restoring, very words that were common in America for so long until recent years. So all of this and hearing us say, how shocking it is to hear these positive terms. It's very indicative of what I believe we can look forward to, a change in the fiber of the operation, the connectivity, the tone, the flavor that should spread across the country. So I am hopeful. Vice President-elect Biden did say he wanted the cabinet to represent America. Well on his way. Well on his way.
Anybody else want to respond? Nope. Okay. One last question that goes to the idea of comfort and the idea of melding. Reverend Jesse Jackson wanted to go away from melting pot to a salad. That was his preferred way of describing what America should be. And in our previous panel, I asked Colton Harris whether he was happy going to the Williams School and Connecticut College rather than going to the to a historically Black college or university. And in our discussions, getting ready for that conversation, I talked about how Brandeis University, which was originally established to let Jewish kids that weren't being admitted to other schools to go to university, is now majority not Jewish. And I watched Between the World and Me 2 nights ago, where a student at Howard University was dating a woman from India, and she came back from visiting her parents in India, and he said to her, "Damn girl, you're Black now. You're not Indian, you're Black." And I was wondering if you think in the long-term future, just as Brandeis University became majority not Jewish, if white students will eventually go to historically Black colleges and universities, and if will that upset the comfort that those students have at those schools, just the way Jewish students used to feel comfortable at Brandeis and Yeshiva and still do feel comfortable, but it's a different world now. Anybody?
I don't know about, I'm gonna go slightly in a different direction. I mean, I want to affirm the Jesse Jackson idea. You know, I think it's really important for us to have both our commonality and our love for our diversity. You know, that they're not contradictory. They're in tension, but they're not contradictory. And right, it's each individual deserves to be who they are, and groups deserve to have their experience. I mean, I said something about all lives matter before, right? And it's true that all lives do matter, but it's a form of blindness to the Black experience, right? That there's a specific Black experience in America that has to do with racism, right? That we have to address, and there's a specific Jewish experience, and it's, you know, for good and bad, we're happy to keep having a Jewish experience, you know, and I'm not worried about Brandeis. The Jewish kids are fine. Are fine. You know, but I think it is important to affirm that when we say commonality and solidarity, it's the commonality of different individuals and different groups, and the solidarity of people who have their own experience and who their own experience should be honored.
Yeah, and the fierce devotion that alums have to the HBCUs you know, I went on a civil rights tour last spring, and one of the places we went to was Tuskegee University, and it's so moving to see how comfortable students are in their skin. And so I was thrilled to witness that, and I don't feel qualified to imagine how that could possibly change. But right now, it just felt great on that campus. My daughter went to a women's college, and you know, the feeling on that campus feels really powerful in a different kind of way. So who knows how these things will play out in time.
Reverend McKenzie, you want to weigh in?
I wasn't until you asked. I kind of go with Rabbi Schwartz. The diversity is good, the commonality and the collegiality of that oneness. We have to be careful that our love for doesn't become something that separates us. We don't want that. So it takes a conscious effort to, as we're blending, to appreciate the wholeness of each other, and then watch what God creates. And that sounds, you know, intense.
No, it sounds good.
But I think we could only go so far, and we've got to yield and surrender to the higher power and let that move us as humankind to work through those differences and become what he wants us to be.
Great.
And I'm going to jump in there because
I want to thank Lisa, first of all, and then everybody else. But Lisa, thank you very much. You did a great job.
Thank you to everybody. It was delightful. Thank you very much. So,
that's my job by being at the end. I get to thank all of you.
okay.
So let me thank Lisa also for steering us through a stimulating conversation. And I want to remind our audience members that the exhibit that sparked all these discussions will remain up at Grua Center until December 19th. We're Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays from 10 till 2. And if that doesn't suit your schedule, call us. We'll try to arrange another time for you. So I want to thank everyone in the audience for sticking with us and enjoying it. And we appreciate your positive comments. And once again, to our panelists, oh my goodness, for sharing your important stories. You were very generous and candid in your remarks, and we moved through some tough topics. And I think you've given us a lot of insight and compassion, that other word I think that came up a couple of times. We really appreciate that. So I sign off again with our thanks to everyone. So good night, everyone. Bye-bye.
Good night.
Thank you, everybody.